Wells, Hitler, and the World State. In March or April, say the wiseacres, there is to be a stupendous knockout blow at Britain. What Hitler has to do it with, I cannot imagine. His ebbing and dispersed military resources are now probably not so very much greater than the Italians before they were put to the test in Greece and Africa. The German air power has been largely spent. It is behind the times, and its first-rate men are mostly dead or disheartened or worn out. In 1914, the Hohenzollern army was the best in the world. Behind that screaming little defective in Berlin, there is nothing of the sort. Yet, our military experts discuss the waiting phantom. In their imaginations, it is perfect in its equipment and invincible in discipline. Sometimes it is to strike a decisive blow through Spain and North Africa and on, or march through the Balkans, march from the Danube to Ankara, to Persia, to India, or crush Russia, or pour over the Brenner into Italy. The weeks pass, and the phantom does none of these things for one excellent reason. It does not exist to that extent. Most of such inadequate guns and munitions as it possessed must have been taken away from it and fooled away in Hitler's silly feints to invade Britain. And its raw, jerry-built discipline is wilting under the creeping realization that the blitzkrieg is spent, and the war is coming home to roost. These quotations are not taken from the Cavalry Quarterly, but from a series of newspaper articles by Mr. H. G. Wells, written at the beginning of this year and now reprinted in a book entitled Guide to the New World. Since they were written, the German army has overrun the Balkans and reconquered Cyrenaica. It can march through Turkey or Spain at such time as may suit it, and it has undertaken the invasion of Russia. How that campaign will turn out, I do not know, but it is worth noticing that the German General Staff, whose opinion is probably worth something, would not have begun it if they had not felt fairly certain of finishing it within 3 months. So much for the idea that the German army is a bogey, its equipment inadequate, its morale breaking down, etc., etc. What has Wells to set against the screaming little defective in Berlin? The usual rigmarole about a world state, plus the Sankey Declaration, which is an attempted definition of fundamental human rights, of anti-totalitarian tendency. Except that he is now especially concerned with federal world control of air power. It is the same gospel as he has been preaching almost without interruption for the past 40 years, always with an air of angry surprise at the human beings who can fail to grasp anything so obvious. What is the use of saying that we need federal world control of the air? The whole question is how we are to get it. What is the use of pointing out that a world state is desirable? What matters is not that one of the 5 great military powers would think of submitting to such a thing. All sensible men for decades past have been substantially in agreement with what Mr. Wells says. But the sensible men have no power and, in too many cases, no disposition to sacrifice themselves. Hitler is a criminal lunatic, and Hitler has an army of millions of men, aeroplanes in thousands, tanks in tens of thousands. For his sake, a great nation has been willing to overwork itself for 6 years and then to fight for 2 years more, whereas, for the common sense, essentially hedonistic worldview which Mr. Wells puts forward, hardly a human creature is willing to shed a pint of blood. Before you can even talk of world reconstruction, or even of peace, you have got to eliminate Hitler, which means bringing into being a dynamic not necessarily the same as that of the Nazis, but probably quite as unacceptable to enlightened and hedonistic people. What has kept England on its feet during the past year? In part, no doubt, some vague idea about a better future, but chiefly the atavistic emotion of patriotism, the ingrained feeling of the English-speaking peoples that they are superior to foreigners. For the last 20 years, the main object of English left-wing intellectuals has been to break this feeling down, and if they had succeeded, we might be watching the SS men patrolling the London streets at this moment. Similarly, why are the Russians fighting like tigers against the German invasion? In part, perhaps, for some half-remembered ideal of utopian socialism, but chiefly in defense of Holy Russia, the sacred soil of the fatherland, etc., etc., which Stalin has revived in an only slightly altered form. The energy that actually shapes the world springs from emotions, racial pride, leader worship, religious belief, love of war, which liberal intellectuals mechanically write off as anachronisms, and which they have usually destroyed so completely in themselves as to have lost all power of action. The people who say that Hitler is Antichrist, or alternatively, the Holy Ghost, are nearer an understanding of the truth than the intellectuals who, for 10 dreadful years, have kept it up that he is merely a figure out of comic opera, not worth taking seriously. All that this idea really reflects is the sheltered conditions of English life. The Left Book Club was, at bottom, a product of Scotland Yard, just as the Peace Pledge Union is a product of the Navy. One development of the last 10 years has been the appearance of the political book, a sort of enlarged pamphlet combining history with political criticism as an important literary form. But the best writers in this line, Trotsky, Rauschning, Rosenberg, Silone, Borkenau, Köstler, and others, have none of them been Englishmen, and nearly all of them have been renegades from one or other extremist party, who have seen totalitarianism at close quarters and known the meaning of exile and persecution. Only in the English-speaking countries was it fashionable to believe, right up to the outbreak of war, that Hitler was an unimportant lunatic and the German tanks made of cardboard. Mr. Wells, it will be seen from the quotations I have given above, believes something of the kind still. I do not suppose that either the bombs or the German campaign in Greece have altered his opinion. A lifelong habit of thought stands between him and an understanding of Hitler's power. Mr. Wells, like Dickens, belongs to the non-military middle class. The thunder of guns, the jingle of spurs, the catch in the throat when the old flag goes by, leave him manifestly cold. He has an invincible hatred of the fighting, hunting, swashbuckling side of life, symbolized in all his early books by a violent propaganda against horses. The principal villain in his Outline of History is the military adventurer, Napoleon. If one looks through nearly any book that he has written in the last 40 years, one finds the same idea constantly recurring. The supposed antithesis between the man of science who is working towards a planned world state and the reactionary who is trying to restore a disorderly past. In novels, utopias, essays, films, pamphlets, the antitheses crop up, always more or less the same. On the one side, science, order, progress, internationalism, aeroplanes, steel, concrete, hygiene. On the other side, war, nationalism, religion, monarchy, peasants, Greek professors, poets, horses. History, as he sees it, is a series of victories won by the scientific man over the romantic man. Now, he is probably right in assuming that a reasonable, planned form of society, with scientists rather than witch doctors in control, will prevail sooner or later. But that is a different matter from assuming that it is just round the corner. There survives, somewhere or other, an interesting controversy which took place between Wells and Churchill at the time of the Russian Revolution. Wells accuses Churchill of not really believing his own propaganda about the Bolsheviks being monsters dripping with blood, etc., but of merely fearing that they were going to introduce an era of common sense and scientific control, in which flag wavers like Churchill himself would have no place. Churchill's estimate of the Bolsheviks, however, was nearer the mark than Wells's. The early Bolsheviks may have been angels or demons, according as one chooses to regard them, but at any rate they were not sensible men. They were not introducing a Wellsian utopia, but a rule of the saints, which, like the English rule of the saints, was a military despotism enlivened by witchcraft trials. The same misconception reappears in an inverted form in Wells's attitude to the Nazis. Hitler is all the warlords and witch doctors in history rolled into one. Therefore, argues Wells, he is an absurdity, a ghost from the past, a creature doomed to disappear almost immediately. But unfortunately, the equation of science with common sense does not really hold good. The aeroplane, which was looked forward to as a civilizing influence, but in practice has hardly been used except for dropping bombs, is the symbol of that fact. Modern Germany is far more scientific than England, and far more barbarous. Much of what Wells has imagined and worked for is physically there in Nazi Germany. The order, the planning, the state encouragement of science, the steel, the concrete, the aeroplanes, are all there, but in the service of ideas appropriate to the Stone Age. Science is fighting on the side of superstition. But obviously it is impossible for Wells to accept this. It would contradict the worldview on which his own works are based. The warlords and the witch doctors must fail. The common sense world state, as seen by a 19th century liberal whose heart does not leap at the sound of bugles, must triumph. Treachery and defeatism apart, Hitler cannot be a danger. That he should finally win would be an impossible reversal of history, like a Jacobite restoration. But is it not a sort of parricide for a person of my age, 38, to find fault with H.G. Wells? Thinking people who were born about the beginning of this century are in some sense Wells's own creation. How much influence any mere writer has, and especially a popular writer whose work takes effect quickly, is questionable. But I doubt whether anyone who was writing books between 1900 and 1920, at any rate in the English language, influenced the young so much. The minds of all of us, and therefore the physical world, would be perceptibly different if Wells had never existed. Only just the singleness of mind, the one-sided imagination that made him seem like an inspired prophet in the Edwardian age, made him a shallow, inadequate thinker now. When Wells was young, the antithesis between science and reaction was not false. Society was ruled by narrow-minded, profoundly incurious people, predatory businessmen, dull squires, bishops, politicians who could quote Horace but had never heard of algebra. Science was faintly disreputable, and religious belief obligatory. Traditionalism, stupidity, snobbishness, patriotism, superstition, and love of war seemed to be all on the same side. There was need of someone who could state the opposite point of view. Back in the 1900s, it was a wonderful experience for a boy to discover H.G. Wells. There you were, in a world of pedants, clergymen, and golfers, with your future employers exhorting you to get on or get out, with your parents systematically warping your sexual life, and your dull-witted schoolmasters sniggering over their Latin tags. And here was this wonderful man who could tell you about the inhabitants of the planets and the bottom of the sea, and who knew that the future was not going to be what respectable people imagined. A decade or so before aeroplanes were technically feasible, Wells knew that within a little while men would be able to fly. He knew that because he himself wanted to be able to fly, and therefore felt sure that research in that direction would continue. On the other hand, even when I was a little boy, at a time when the Wright brothers had actually lifted their machine off the ground for 59 seconds, the generally accepted opinion was that if God had meant us to fly, he would have given us wings. Up to 1914, Wells was, in the main, a true prophet. In physical details, his vision of the new world has been fulfilled to a surprising extent. But because he belonged to the 19th century and to a non-military nation and class, he could not grasp the tremendous strength of the old world which was symbolized in his mind by fox-hunting Tories. He was, and still is, quite incapable of understanding that nationalism, religious bigotry, and feudal loyalty are far more powerful forces than what he himself would describe as sanity. Creatures out of the Dark Ages have come marching into the present, and if they are ghosts, they are at any rate ghosts which need a strong magic to lay them. The people who have shown the best understanding of fascism are either those who have suffered under it or those who have a fascistic streak in themselves. A crude book like The Iron Heel, written nearly 30 years ago, is a truer prophecy of the future than either Brave New World or The Shape of Things to Come. If one had to choose among Wells's own contemporaries a writer who could stand towards him as a corrective, one might choose Kipling, who was not deaf to the evil voices of power and military glory. Kipling would have understood the appeal of Hitler, or, for that matter, of Stalin, whatever his attitude towards them might be. Wells is too sane to understand the modern world. The succession of lower middle-class novels, which are his greatest achievement, stopped short at the other war and never really began again, and, since 1920, he has squandered his talents in slaying paper dragons. But how much it is, after all, to have any talents to squander.